We just began chapter 4. Every day of the week was assigned to some particular religious thought. Uh, we looked at that, and the funny idea that in this way Stephen would gain some merit, which would be like pressing fingers on a keyboard of a great cash register. So I discussed the humor in this passage. Uh, then there is some discussion about the uh, Blessed Trinity, Stephen's devotion to the Trinity, and then last page, bottom of the page, 135 in my edition, Stephen talks about the Holy Spirit and the Son. He, at the last sentence of the page, he had heard the names of the passions of love and hate pronounced solemnly on the stage and in the pulpit, had found them set forth solemnly in books, and had wondered why his soul was unable to harbor them for any time, or to force his lips to utter their names with conviction. So the idea of love is very important in Christianity, as you know, and the emotions of hate and anger, they are also considered to be sinful. But Stephen examines himself, why he finds it very difficult to sustain any of these emotions. A brief anger had often invested him, but he had never been able to make it an abiding passion, and had always felt himself passing out of it as if his very body were being diverted with ease of some outer skin or peel. He had felt a subtle, dark and murmurous presence penetrate his being and fire him with a brief iniquitous lust. It too had slipped beyond his grasp, leaving his mind lucid and indifferent. This, it seemed, was the only love, and that the only hate his soul would harbor. So he felt that sometimes he would be angry, but the anger won't be sustained. It will quickly pass. And then he felt a subtle, dark and murmurous presence penetrate his being and fire him with a brief iniquitous lust. So this presence, or this passion, which is that of lust, iniquity, that cannot be good, that is sinful. And the metaphor used here, penetrating his being, which is a sexual metaphor. So even this lustful passion leaves him, and then he is left indifferent. And that is the kind of love or hate that he can harbor. So what is suggested here is that Stephen has the temperament of an artist, and therefore the emotions flit through him. He feels them temporarily, but they are not sustained, because he always looks beyond those emotions and tries to reach a point where he is indifferent to any of the passions. So this detachment from immediate involvement or immediate emotion is important for an artist. Without this kind of a detachment, it is difficult for an artist to create. So it is this suggestion that is made here, that whether it is love, anger, lust, none of these emotions are abiding emotions in Stephen, but it is indifferent and a kind of detachment which is more abiding. Then Stephen thinks of how he can purify himself or purge himself of all evil, sinful emotions. Now, I told you that in this chapter we find Stephen being very religious. just the opposite of the previous chapter. So here, like a good Roman Catholic, he is trying to purify himself, purge himself of evil emotions through mortification. So mortification of the senses. Uh, Meek and abased by this consciousness of the one eternal, omnipresent, perfect reality, his soul took up again her burden of pieties, masses and prayers and sacraments and mortifications. And only then, for the first time since he had brooded on the great mystery of love, did he feel within him a warm movement like that of some newly born life or virtue of the soul itself. So, the different religious activities in which he indulges now, they are piety, attending masses, prayers, sacraments and mortifications. And here mortifications become important to Stephen because Stephen lives his life through sensuous and sensual experience. Because he is an artist, so his senses are very acute. Sense of vision, smell, touch and so on. So all these senses, he indulges in all these senses in an intense manner. And if the sense experience which he indulges is sinful, then as a Catholic he believes that mortification of the senses is important. That is, he must give all these senses displeasure or discomfort, or punish these senses, or punish himself through these senses by discomfort. But he had been forewarned of the dangers of spiritual exaltation and did not allow himself to desist from even the least of lowliest devotion, striving also by constant mortification to undo the sinful past rather than to achieve a saintliness fraught with peril. So he realized that only saintliness is of no use. Rather, there is always a peril, always a danger. If somebody wants to live a saintly life, then he would always face temptations. So Christians believe that these are the temptations by Satan. So saintliness with peril is less desirable than purging himself of his sinful past through mortification. Each of his senses was brought under a rigorous discipline. In order to mortify the sense of sight, he made it his rule to walk in the street with downcast eyes, glancing neither to right nor left and never behind him. So that means he will deprive his sight of any pleasant scene, of any pleasant experience by not looking at things. His eyes shunned every encounter with the eyes of women. From time to time also he balked them by a sudden effort of the will, as by lifting them suddenly in the middle of an unfinished sentence and closing the book. To mortify his hearing, he exerted no control over his voice, which was then breaking, neither sang nor whistled, and made no attempt to flee from noises which caused him painful nervous irritation, such as the sharpening of knives on the knife board, the gathering of cinders on the fire shovel, and the twigging of the carpet. So certain noises are very irritating, like scrubbing something, scratching something and so on, shoveling and so on. So Stephen would mortify his hearing by listening to these sounds. He would not try to protect himself from these sounds. Similarly, he would mortify his smell. To mortify his smell was more difficult, as he found in himself no instinctive repugnance to bad odors, whether they were the odors of the outdoor world, such as those of dung and tar, or the odors of his own person, among which he had made many curious comparisons and experiments. So, foul smells or bad odors, Stephen was not particularly repugnant to them. Probably because he was an artist, so he thought that the foul smells, they also play a role in life. So he was curious about them also. He made experiments with his body odor or smell coming from his own person. Therefore, to modify his smell was very difficult. He found in the end that the only odor against which his sense of smell revolted was a certain stale fishy stink like that of long-standing urine, and whenever it was possible he subjected himself to this unpleasant odor. To modify the taste, he practiced strict habits at table, observed to the letter all the fasts of the church, and sought by distraction to divert his mind from the savours of different foods. So this was easy, modifying the sense of taste, because anybody who loves food, if he deprives himself of food, then he can modify his taste. Then he goes on to talk about how he tried to merge his life in the common ride of other lives and how it was very hard for him. So we know about his innate sense of alienation. But now, as a good Christian, he wanted to completely identify with the community, and he found it very difficult, but he tried. The idea of surrender had a perilous attraction for his mind now that he felt his soul beset once again by the insistent voices of the flesh, which began to murmur to him again during his prayers and meditations. So he felt that the urge of indulging in sexual pleasure, in suppressing that urge, and the idea of surrender was very attractive. He seemed to feel a flood slowly advancing towards his naked feet, and to be waiting for the first faint, timid, noiseless wavelet to touch his fevered skin. So this intense desire that seemed to touch him. But finally he is able to elude the temptation. Alright. So here Stephen describes his struggle against desire. And when he feels that he has been able to mortify his senses, he has been able to desist from indulging in sexual pleasure, then at the bottom of this section he says, "I have amended my life, have I not?" he asked himself. So you see here a kind of a satisfaction that he derives from the fact that he has amended his life. So we may say that this is a movement from the state of desire to the state of spirituality or religiosity. But this abstract struggle is soon replaced by actual demands upon him by the church. So these Jesuit fathers, when they see that Stephen was living the life of an ideal religious boy, then they wanted to induct him into the order. And they wanted him to join priesthood. And the rest of the chapter is about Stephen's struggle with this idea. And this portion is long because this is one of the greatest temptations that stand between Stephen becoming an artist and his present stature as a person growing and trying to find his vocation. So as a novel of growth, one would expect that there would be an attempt to find the vocation of the hero, of the protagonist. So in a sense this novel is also a search for Stephen's vocation. And in this chapter, chapter 4, we see that he has been offered the vocation of a priest. But is that his calling? Is that his true destiny or true vocation? So So Stephen struggles with it, and we may say that his life as depicted in this novel from his infancy to his youth, Roman Catholicism or religion had an immense role on his development. And therefore, will he be able to join the order, which would be the kind of highest success and acceptance by the community, by the Jesuit order? If he is accepted as a priest, that would be a kind of highest achievement for him. But the point is, does he really want it? So we have seen that Stephen was also, to some extent, from his childhood, was against the regimentation of the Roman Catholic order. And this other aspect of his character, we may say, the rebellious aspect, that is no less strong than this religious, obedient, virtuous aspect of Stephen's character when he is very close to being a priest in the Jesuit order. So two aspects of his character, or we may say two sides of his psyche, they come into conflict in the fourth chapter, in this chapter, when he must decide for himself, for once and all, whether he would become a priest in his life or an artist. So the two strong tendencies are in competition with each other, and they cloud Stephen's psyche. So the temptation to join the religious order comes directly from the director of the Jesuit order of his school. The director stood in the embrasure of the window, his back to the light, leaning an elbow on the brown cross blind, and as he spoke and smiled, slowly dangling and looping the cord of the other blind. Now this scene is an encounter, we may say, or we may say an interview, we may say a dialogue with the director of the Jesuit order. And in this scene there is an epiphany. Here the director is described in terms which make him appear to be sinister or evil. He is standing in the shadow, his back to the light. So his face cannot be clearly discerned, only his voice can be heard. And he is dangling the loops of the cord of the blind in his fingers, which is another sinister evocation of the, cord by which one could be hanged, the gallows. So will joining the Roman Catholic order be to Stephen hanging himself forever or sacrificing himself in the gallows by not following his pursuit of being an artist? So through hints and suggestions, through images, this experience is narrated. Stephen stood before him, following for a moment with his eyes the waning of the long summer daylight above the roofs of the slow deft movements of the priestly fingers. So he is looking at the movement of the fingers of the priest, and the priest is dangling the loops of the cord in his fingers. So that is a moment of epiphany when Stephen sees something, and from that sight or that experience he gathers some meaning or some revelation. The priest's face was in total shadow, but the waning daylight from behind touched the deeply grooved temples and the curves of the skull. So light falling on the temples of the skull, the highlight, as we say, an artist who paints a face nose where highlights are to be put. The temples on the skull receive the highlight. So that the way the light falls on the skull, that reminds the reader of skull or death. We earlier saw that how the Jesuit fathers, they keep a skull on their desk. When Stephen went to complain to the rector, he saw that on his desk there was a skull. I told you earlier that the skull was a representation of memento mori, remembrance of death. Jesuit fathers always wanted to be reminded of death, the inevitability of death. So they kept a skull on their desk. And here the father's head, as the light falls on his temples, it highlights his skull. So another remembrance, or you may say reminding of the death image. Stephen followed also with his ears the accents and intervals of the priest's voice as he spoke gravely and cordially of indifferent themes: the vacation which had just ended, the colleges of the order abroad, the transference of masters. So the priest talks at length on different themes, different topics. Why? Because he won't suddenly give him the invitation. He wants first to prepare Stephen's mind through different kinds of conversation for this offer, because this offer to join the order is a very significant offer. It will decide forever how Stephen is going to spend the rest of his life, and therefore he talks about a lot of other things before he can broach the subject. Stephen felt bound to set it on again with respectful questions. He knew that the tale was a prelude, and his mind waited for the sequel. Ever since the message of summons had come for him from the director, his mind had struggled to find the meaning of the message. And the director speaks on Dominican and Franciscan orders, the different orders of the Roman Catholic religion, and the friendship between Saint Thomas and Saint Bonaventure. They are the chief representatives, we may say, famous names in these two orders. And then they talk about the example of the Franciscans and how the monks in Belgium wear a kind of long dress which covers their whole body. And Stephen says that in Belgium they call this dress les jupes, French word. So Stephen is always interested in words, we know that, and he is always interested in matters of language. But the director is of course indifferent to language, and he did not know the word, and once again he asked, what are they called? Les jupes. Stephen repeats. So even this dialogue contains some reflections on language, as we will see that Stephen has a long dialogue with the English teacher of his school, and there are many discussions about language. Then some talk on literature, Lord Macaulay, Victor Hugo, and so on. Then finally director comes to this topic. I sent for you today, page 142, Stephen, because I wish to speak to you on a very important subject. Yes, sir. Have you ever felt that you had a vocation? Stephen parted his lips to answer yes, and then withheld the word suddenly, because he always wanted to become an artist, but he realized that he cannot tell the director that. The director is expecting something else, so he stops and does not say anything. The priest waited for the answer and added, I mean, have you ever felt within yourself, in your soul, a desire to join the order? Think. I have sometimes thought of it, said Stephen. The priest let the blind cot fall to one side and, uniting his hands, leaned his chin gravely upon them, communing with himself. And then he explains what is the significance of becoming a priest. To receive that call, Stephen, said the priest, is the greatest honor that the Almighty God can bestow upon a man. To receive that call. So we have this word calling, which means vocation. Now why is it called calling? Because Christians believe that God calls a man to his vocation. So one who would be a priest would receive God's call in his mind, and that is why it is called a calling. So the director, instead of saying that I am offering you this vocation, this job, would you like to join it, says that have you received this call from God? That is, joining the Jesuit order is not looked upon like joining an employment or any job. So unless one has an inner urge to become a priest, he would normally not be offered offered to join the order. To receive that call is the greatest honor that the Almighty God can bestow upon a man. No king or emperor on this earth has the power of the priest of God. No angel or archangel in heaven, no saint, not even the Blessed Virgin herself, has the power of a priest of God. What is the power of a priest? The director explains. The power of the keys, the power to bind and to loose from sin, the power of exorcism, the power to cast out from the creatures of God the evil spirits that have power over them, the power, the authority to make the great God of heaven come down upon the altar and take the form of bread and wine. What an awful power, Stephen. So this power of the priest is symbolically suggested through the image of the key. Now it was believed that Saint Peter was given the key to the church, and he became the first bishop of Rome, and therefore the later bishops of Rome, they who are called popes, they all hold this position that once Saint Peter held. Now the key is a symbolical image, as the priest explains here, that it is the key by which the priest binds or unbinds a soul from sin. So a priest can exorcise or purge evil, and by unbinding or loosening send a soul to heaven, or can bind him and therefore the soul will go to hell. So this is considered a spiritual power of the priest. That is, the priest is the mediator of God who works upon souls. And the idea of exorcism, for example, the Roman Catholics believe in exorcism. That is, if there is an evil power that has entered into somebody, the priest can exorcise that evil and send it back to hell from where it came. So the Roman Catholics believe in the priest's power over souls and the power of binding souls either to heaven or hell. So this is an awful power. It is a spiritual power. And then the priest mentions the Mass, the Eucharist, the ritual of Eucharist, when the priest breaks a wafer and feeds a person during the Mass, and also drops of wine. He lets he pours drops of wine into the mouth of a person and feeds him a wafer. Roman Catholics believe that miraculously the wafer and the wine, they turn into the flesh and blood of Christ, which means that the Spirit of Christ enters the person through the ritual of the Eucharist during the Mass. And therefore this is an awful power. So according to the priest, God takes the form of bread and wine during the Eucharist, and by the mediation of the priest. A flame began to flutter again on Stephen's cheek as he heard in this proud address an echo of his own proud musings. How often had he seen himself as a priest wielding calmly and humbly the awful power of which angels and saints stood in reverence. So you see, paradoxically, there is a pride expressed in the words of the priest, the pride about the power of a priest. And Stephen also felt this pride when he thought or imagined that he would become a priest and he would have this great power. So we know that pride is the most cardinal sin, the greatest sin. Young and his soul had loved to muse in secret on this desire. He had seen himself a young and silent-mannered priest entering a confessional swiftly, ascending the altar steps, incensing, genuflecting, accomplishing the vague acts of the priesthood, which pleased him by reason of their semblance of reality and of their distance from it. In the dim life which he had lived through in his musings, he had assumed the voices and gestures which he had noted with various priests. He had bent his knee sideways like such a one. He had shaken the thurible only slightly like such a one. His chasuble had swung open like that of such another, as he had turned to the altar again after having blessed the people. So, in his imagination, he often imitated several priests in their action. Thus, we have a detailed narration of how Stephen was tempted by the vocation of priesthood. He listened in reverent silence now to the priest's appeal, and through the words he heard even more distinctly a voice bidding him approach, offering him secret knowledge and secret power. He would know then what was the sin of Simon Magus and what the sin against the Holy Ghost for which there was no forgiveness. So this pride is a sin, and Stephen felt that for this sin there would be no forgiveness. So the director gives him some time to decide and tells him that you let me know tomorrow. It is a solemn question, Stephen, because on it may depend the salvation of your eternal soul, but we will pray to God together. And then Stephen keeps thinking, pondering over this offer, how he would be proud if he is made a father, and then after his name he can use the letters SJ, which Jesuit fathers use, which means Society of Jesus. The Reverend Stephen Dedalus SJ. So he articulates in his mind this name and title. He would be called the Reverend Stephen Dedalus SJ. His name in that new life leaped into characters before his eyes, and to it there followed a mental sensation of an undefined face or a color of a face. The color faded and became strong like a changing glow of polished brick red. Was it the raw reddish glow he had so often seen on wintry mornings on the shaven grills, guilt of the priest. The face was eyeless and sore-favored and devout, shot with pink tinges of suffocated anger. So, in his imagination, he imagines his face as that of a priest, and on that face there are emotions of pride, anger, the red tint, because in his childhood, throughout his childhood, he had often seen the fathers getting very angry or behaving very tyrannically. So all these evil emotions associated with the Jesuit fathers, they come back to his mind. The voice of the director urging upon him the proud claims of the church and the mystery and power of the priestly office repeated itself idly in his memory. His soul was not there to hear and greet it, and he knew now that the exhortation he had listened to had already fallen into an idle formal tale. So by the at the bottom of page 146, by this time Stephen already knows that he is not attracted by the offer. So in spite of the father giving him this offer, making him this offer, he feels that his soul was not there to hear and greet it. He would never swing the thurible before the tabernacle as priest. His destiny was to be elusive of social or religious orders. The wisdom of the priest's appeal did not touch him to the quick. He was destined to learn his own wisdom apart from others, or to learn the wisdom of others himself, wandering among the snares of the world. So here we see that he has already come to this decision that he will not be a priest. And he would have his own wisdom and not that of others. That is, the wisdom of the priests does not attract him. He must learn in his own way and not be persuaded by other people. Then he comes back home, and immediately he finds his young brothers and sisters. Children often distort language and speak in a mock language. That is what we see here. One of his siblings doing. He sat near them at the table and asked where his father and mother were. One answered, "Gone borrow, to borrow, do borrow, at borrow, a borrow, house borrow." So adding borrow to the end of every word, which means gone to look for a house. That is, they are going to change their house once again. Still another removal. A boy named Fallon in Belvedere had often asked him with a silly laugh why they moved so often. A frown of scorn darkened quickly his forehead as he heard again the silly laugh of the questioner. He asked, "Why are you on the move again, if it is a fair question?" The same sister answered, "Because borrow, the borrow, land borrow, lord borrow, will borrow, put borrow, us borrow, out borrow. Because the landlord will put us out." So, families which are financially weak, they often have to move from house to house because sometimes they find it difficult to pay the rent, and then the landlord, they keep raising the rent, and when the tenant cannot pay the increased rent, then he has to leave the house and look for another house, another landlord. And Stephen's father changed the house several times on several occasions because his financial status had gone down, and that is a reflection of Joyce's own life during his childhood. So Stephen comes back to this very problematic reality of his family, and his head is no longer in the air. He is not thinking about the noble, glorious profession that he might be joining or so on. And he keeps thinking about this refusal, this rejection. He feels that now he is in the university, and he looks back at his childhood and his days at Clongoweswood College, his childhood, infancy spent there, and all that has become dim past, or he has to remember them with difficulty. They are already in the past. Pride after satisfaction uplifted him like long slow waves. The end he had been born to serve, yet did not see, had led him to escape by an unseen path. So in a way he feels good that he has been able to refuse. The pride of the dim image brought back to his mind the dignity of the office he had refused. All through his boyhood he had mused upon that which he had so often thought to be his destiny, and when the moment had come for him to obey the call, he had turned aside, obeying a wayward instinct. So because he was raised in a Roman Catholic school, or a number of Roman Catholic schools, so throughout his infancy and childhood, in his growing age, he imagined that one day he would be a priest. But when that moment finally arrived, when he must make the choice, then an instinct told him or dictated him to refuse this offer. And he described this as a wayward instinct. So this desire, this instinct to become an artist, that is a wayward instinct. That is not the regular thing. Not everybody thinks of becoming an artist. And therefore, if somebody has an instinct that he must be a painter or a poet, this is looked upon as wayward. This is not the regular thing to do. And for this wayward instinct, he had rejected something for which he had been prepared, we may say. All his childhood, throughout his schooling, he was prepared for becoming a priest, and then because of this instinct, he refuses to take this offer. The uncouth faces. Then he sees a few monks, young monks, belonging to the order of Christian brothers, walking, or they were almost like marching, 2 by 2, and they were ugly looking. Their names were ugly. Stephen finds nothing aesthetic about them. So through this experience we find that Stephen's aesthetic sensibility is hurt by the ugliness or lack of aesthetics in the Christian brothers. A squad of Christian brothers was on its way back from the bull and had begun to pass 2 by 2 across the bridge. Soon the whole bridge was trembling and resounding. The uncouth faces passed him 2 by 2, stained yellow or red or livid by the sea, and as he strove to look at them with ease and indifference, a faint stain of personal shame and commiseration rose to his own face. He felt ashamed by looking at these Christian brothers because he was almost going to join their order. So now he feels ashamed to see them. Angry with himself, he tried to hide his face from their eyes by gazing down sideways into the shallow swirling water under the bridge, but he still saw a reflection therein of their top-heavy silk hats and humble tape-like collars and loosely hanging clerical clothes. So the brothers, they call each other by their names: Brother Hickey, Brother Quaid, Brother MacArdle, Brother Keogh. Their piety would be like their names, like their faces, like their clothes, and it was idle for him to tell himself that their humble and contrite hearts, it might be, paid a far richer tribute of devotion than his had ever been, a gift tenfold more acceptable than his elaborate adoration. So the Christian brothers, they were ugly looking, their names were ugly, their clothes were not aesthetic enough, but Stephen knew that their devotion or their piety was much superior to his. So here Stephen has an aesthetic pride, and he tries to criticize himself by this suggestion, auto-suggestion, that He might be more aesthetic minded, but his piety is not superior to that of the Christian brothers. But nevertheless, we see that Stephen here opts for the aesthetics rather than piety, and he would rather follow the pursuit of aesthetics, the pursuit of beauty, than that of piety. A day of dappled sea-born clouds. So he remembers some phrase, beautiful phrase. The phrase and the day and the scene harmonized in a chord, words. Okay, we have past time, so I will stop here, and we need to explain this paragraph in detail. So I will continue it in the next class.